talk to me about the three forces that you see that are influencing this moment. We've got banks collapsing, US dollars under attack, looming recession. What is going on? How do we step back and think about this moment?
I look at three major forces that are happening now, haven't happened in our lifetimes, but have happened many times in history. And those three major forces are the creation of a lot of debt and the printing of a lot of money to buy that debt, particularly because the government is running large deficits. And so they don't have enough money, so that government has to print that money. So that creation of all of that debt and its financial implications and its economic implications is one force. The second force is the internal conflict, the amount of conflict that's internally, largely due to the largest wealth gaps that we've had since the 30s. And that produces populism of the left and the right, particularly when there are financial difficulties. The third force is the rising power, the challenging the existing power, largely in the form of China and to some extent Russia. So let's call it the great power conflict, because in 1945, there's this cycle. You have a war, then after a war, you have winners, and the winners determine the rules of the game. And then there's this evolution of others becoming more competitive, and then you have a conflict again for who's in control. So we have that dynamic taking place. So those three influences, the financial, the internal conflict, external conflict influences are having a dominant influence. I learned before that when I was surprised, often it was because of things that hadn't happened in my lifetime before, but happened in history. Because of that reason, I went back and studied history, the last 500 years, on these cycles. There are big cycles that last about 75 years, give or take about 50 years, and of rises and declines. And I put that out because I think it's so important people understand that. I put it out in a book called The Changing World Order and in a free video called The Changing World Order. So when we look at each one of those, they're important. I also learned in studying history that there were two other influences that were very big, and you could see them. The first was acts of nature, such as droughts, floods, and pandemics. The changes over time in the evolution over time of people's learning and the technologies they make. So I'd say there are the really five big influences that drive everything, and they are the money and debt, economic influence, the internal conflict, the external conflict, the nature influence, and the, let's call it the technology influence. So as we go now into this, it's important. Again, I put it out as a free video on YouTube so that people could see it easily. And when we get into whatever we're going to talk about, it'll be certainly in the context of those things. And since they each affect each other, it produces what I call the big cycle.
The animation that you put out in conjunction with your book, Principles for Dealing with a Changing World Order, have influenced my thinking around this moment more than anyone or anything else. It makes it seem so predictable from a historical perspective when you look at that big cycle and you see how it repeats. And so as you went through the last 500 years, one thing that you make very clear in the book is that the rise and fall of empires, the rise and fall of a reserve currency, they go in this 6-cycle trend. And the part that I always find unnerving is phase 6 is basically war and collapse. And so you have that previously dominant power loses its position, loses its status as a reserve currency, and it loses it for pretty predictable reasons in the three forces that you were talking about in the beginning, discounting the fourth force, which I don't think in every cycle you always had, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but you didn't always have a pandemic or anything like that. But the fact that we're living in a moment right now where we have all of them. And so we've got, not only is it a moment of massive technological disruption right now, good and bad, but we've got the money printing, the meme on the internet is money printer go burr. So we've got, printing because of COVID. We've got printing coming off of printing because of the 2008 collapse. And now we're again seeing this cycle repeat itself. So I've heard you say that we're in somewhere in phase 5, which is as the empire begins to decline, as you have a rising superpower, as the debt bubble is getting out of control. With that perspective, was what happened with the SVB bank collapse, was that something that you knew, okay, something like that is coming, or was that a surprise to you?
No, it was obvious. Look, if you I want to talk about the mechanics, really. I'm so eager to pass along an understanding of the mechanics so people themselves can do the analysis. So one man's debts are another man's assets. Okay, so what happened? The government had to sell a lot of debt. And when it sold a lot of debt, there were a lot of entities that bought a lot of bonds, government bonds. And money was very easy, which meant that short-term interest rates were very low. And money was actually being given away because they had interest-only loans and interest rates were less than 1%. And you didn't have to pay back principal. So you could go get money. And so that created a lot of debt, and it created a lot of buying of government bonds. So what happened to Silicon Valley Bank is what happened to many entities all around the world, not just banks. They what does a bank do? A bank takes in deposits, typically, or debt in some way, and then it buys debt. It can do that in the form of making a loan, or it could do that in the form of buying a government bond, buying debt. And then when interest rates went up, the value of that debt went down. The money they had to give to depositors became more and more expensive. And also depositors, wanting them to be competitive, looked at money market rates or other rates and withdrew money from the bank because they had better uses. Okay, so what that leaves them with, it's a banking problem that has happened literally for thousands of years. That what they do is the depositors, want their money back, and they're holding assets that are, in this case, have gone down in value, so they're broke.
Let me put a fine point on that. Sorry, before you move on, I don't know that people really understand this. Is this a it seems to be a necessary result of fractional reserve banking, meaning that if you deposit $10 to me, I only need to keep, and I think this is actually accurate, I only need to keep $1. And so the other $9 I can actually put to work in terms of loans to other people or investments. And that puts us in a position where, okay, technically you're giving the bank a loan. A deposit isn't just, oh, my money is in a vault somewhere. I've given the bank a loan. The bank is going to go do things with that of varying degrees of risk. In the case of SVB, They thought I'm doing the least risky thing, which is I'm buying government debt. The government is going to back it. The government, especially the US government, can actually print money if they had to cover that, which they did in this case. But if a lot of people go to the bank at the same time, known as a bank run, and say, I want all of my money, the bank goes, whoa, 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 I don't have that money. And so I have all these assets. And as long as those assets remain liquid and I can liquidate them in a timely fashion, then sure, as long as the requests for people's deposits back are coming at a reasonable rate, all is well. But when you get a lot of people coming at once and you have the investments that they've made have gone down in value, now you get a perfect storm.
Exactly. I think you said it very well. You're allowed to be in the business. Let's call it 1/10. It's actually less than 1/10 is your money.
Whoa.
But let's call it 1/10. You have a certain amount of money up. They give you the deposits. You invest the money within these general guidelines. So, for example, government bonds are safe from default. So you buy the government bonds. You think you're making a spread. And then what happens is the government bonds go down in value. At the same time as the people say, hey, I want to go take my money and put it someplace else. So you don't have enough money. And central banking works like that, except the government can print the money. So the risk, and when it's the government, is not that you won't get the money back unless, like in this particular case, for a bank, it goes down in value. So you ain't going to get that back. You're going to sell it. But anyway, you described it very well. What happens for the economy as a whole is then they print the money because they don't want defaults. There's a tolerable amount of defaults, and then you get past a tolerable amount of defaults, and it just crushes everything. And so they print the money. Okay. And so this thing with the bank is not a Silicon Valley Bank alone issue. It's not a banking issue. It is a global issue in terms of all around the world, all sorts of entities, pension funds, insurance companies, all around the world. There was a lot of the buying of these government bonds, which have gone down in value. And if you then take it and you say, what's the value of those? Those have gone down. And the cost of money is high. And so the world is leverage long, okay? Long, meaning they own stuff, and they borrowed money to own it, and it's going down in value.
How nightmarish does that scenario become? So you've got your money locked up in something for a long time, but it's declining in value. Is this like a classic moment where we can look at this big cycle and go, oh, we know where this goes, like the music has stopped, everybody, or no, it's a bit harder to judge than that?
I think it's pretty easy to judge on an intermediate or longer term basis because there's a choice, right? The big issue is, okay, the government can come in and print the money and give money to anybody they want to give money to. But when they do that, that typically devalues the money. So think about it, if you're holding a bond, you got a claim on money, but the claims are too much. So one way or another, you're either not going to get back that money in full, or you're going to get back money that's worth less because they print the money.
Whoa. Ray, I've never heard anybody say it like that. So let me just make sure that I understood that. The government has effectively issued too many bonds, so people they're holding
and a lot of companies and a lot of other things too.
Okay, very good point. So we're not just buying the bonds from the government, we're buying corporate bonds, municipal bonds, like anybody that wants to put some debt out into the market. Government, of course. In fact, I'm actually curious, what's the ratio roughly, if you know this, between corporate debt and government debt?
Well, right now, I couldn't give you the exact number off the top of my head, but there's um, household debt, um, corporate debt, and government debt.
Yeah, that's terrifying. So even if you took every dollar that our entire country makes, I think it's true globally. If you took every dollar that we make globally and tried to pay off the debt, you wouldn't be able to do it.
Well, that's right, but it's not expected to pay it off in a year.
Sure.
I want to go back to my main point to make this clear. If you're holding that debt, you are holding something that money will come back. Let's say the government can print the money, but if the money's hard, if that's going to be good money that's coming back, it's going to be hard for those entities to pay back because it's a lot relative to their income and cash flows to pay it. And that means that the default risk rises. However, because you're holding that, it means that the debt will be bad one way or another. It's either bad because they don't pay it, it needs a haircut for them to pay it, or because they do pay it with money that is going to be printed to come back. So when you look at that, and that problem occurs when there's a lot of debt assets and a lot of debt liabilities. So think of it this way, just want to make this clear. When there was the position that interest rates got a lot below the inflation rate, you're losing buying power. There's no good reason to own that. And there's a change in psychology because before there was, I own bonds. The bonds go up in value as interest rates go down. So I'm getting a price appreciation, even though I'm getting, let's say a low interest rate, but inflation isn't a problem until it's a problem. Then when it's a problem, because they print so much money and they put it out, then inflation goes up and a light bulb goes off. That light bulb used to be, okay, how much am I earning? Okay, I'm not earning much, but it's okay. The price of the bond or whatever's gone up, but anyway, I'm holding it and it's safe. And then people realize it's not safe because I'm losing money to inflation. So now you have the central bank wanting to rectify that imbalance by, real interest rates were minus 1.7%.
Meaning that inflation was chipping away at your buying power.
Yes, if I look at inflation index bonds as an indicator, or other indicators, I'm losing percentage points to inflation by holding that bond. And then when and people realize that, well, you don't want to do that. And then the other side of it was you want to buy and borrow and buy stuff because, money's free. So companies borrow and buy stuff and individuals borrow and buy houses because interest only loans on the houses. I mean, okay, I can buy a house, I can buy an apartment. And so, but that creates the imbalance where it's terrible to be a lender and a creditor, and it's good to be a borrower and do that. So that imbalance takes place. It produces inflation, and then when it produces inflation and so on, and then you say, I don't want to own these things anymore, And then, and also the Federal Reserve says, I better fight inflation. They change things. And so by raising interest rates to levels in which it goes from minus 1.7% in inflation index bonds to plus 1.7%, and it makes it, and it raises the short-term interest rates, real interest rates much higher, then lo and behold, all the people who did all those things get hurt. Okay. They borrowed, they bought the bonds, they bought all of those things and all of those debt instruments. And also companies. Look at the companies that are affected. Because yields got so low, tech companies and others, those who have a dream, they don't have to necessarily make profits. They're selling a dream, and the money's got to be invested. And so you see all of that change radically when that tightening of monetary policy. So now you sit there and have a lows. So when you're looking at the big picture, think of it as all like banking. You're holding all these financial assets. What is the value of a financial asset? It has no intrinsic value. Its only value is what it can buy. But there are many, many more financial assets out there. The most financial assets out there that there's ever been relative to the value of stuff to buy. There's too many claims out there. It's like musical chairs. Okay, if everybody says, "Oh, wait a second, let me get my stuff. Let me convert my debt assets. And I want to get my stuff. I want to get real stuff." That's a real problem. And so that's the global picture on the first of those 5 influences, right? The fact that it's happening with the other influences is very important because they affect each other. So this financial picture, by the way, is the same as in the 1930 to 45 period, and the same as they were throughout history.
You can reboot your life, your health, even your career, anything you want. All you need is discipline. I can teach you the tactics that I learned while growing a billion-dollar business that will allow you to see your goals through. Whether you want better health, stronger relationships, a more successful career, any of that is possible with the mindset and business programs in Impact Theory University. Join the thousands of students who have already accomplished amazing things. Tap now for a free trial and get started today. Yeah. For people that don't know, that's World War II. Just to
it started with a financial crisis that then caused internal conflict. What do we do about the financial crisis? The populism of the left and populism of the right in this internal fighting. And 4 countries that were democracies chose not to be democracies because of the conflicts that were existing. And those countries were Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan, and because there's a lot of internal conflict over wealth when you have that. And so that creates a lot of internal disorder, a lot of fighting, okay? In some ways, almost civil war forms everywhere, some form of civil war. Who wins the internal war? And of course, that happens also at the same time as there's the external conflict. So first of all, everybody's fighting over resources. You have populists come to power, and the populists are not compromisers the way democracies work.
Yeah, let's fight. I'm going to fight for you. Don't worry. I'm not in the middle. I'm not going to compromise.
And you've got to pick a side. And so the moderates, there's no place for moderates. You've got to pick a side. And the sides are, let's say, internally in the country, the left and the right, and externally, I don't know, the Americans and the Chinese, or the Americans, okay, and you got to pick a side and fight. And so that becomes the dynamic that is these periods of time. And these periods of time have typically lasted about 10 to 15 years. And they have various symptoms to it. So in the book, I write out, there's like a disease, like a cancer. You see stage 1, 2, 3, 4. If you have these things, you could look at it and you could diagnose, and you see it moving from stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 and to 6. You could see that taking place. And each time you come closer to a bad set of circumstances, bad financial circumstances, and bad fighting over things.
Yeah, so this is where this gets really breathtaking. So you've talked a lot about this idea that there are things, you even mentioned at the beginning of this episode, there are things that have not happened in our lifetime, but they happen over and over and over. And so it is very easy for me as somebody born in the 70s to think, oh, war isn't a thing that happens in the US, it's something that happens elsewhere. Populism isn't something that happens in the US, it's something that happens elsewhere. But it does happen. We're seeing it ratchet up right now because of that. I heard you once say, and I think this is really important for people to understand about the internal conflict. In fact, you and I bumped into each other in Dubai, and I was saying, Ray, as given everything that's going on, how do I think? How do I think about where to live? Whatever. And you said, Tom, the only thing that matters is how people are with each other. And for whatever reason, it really hit me that time what you meant by that, and I understood the importance of this conflict. And what I heard you say previously is that in the French Revolution, it was the moderates that got the guillotine. It's like you are forced, because I consider myself very centrist in nature, and you find yourself, as things escalate, being forced to take a side, which the French Revolution one gave me pause. I was like, not how I would want to end up as a moderate. Really fast, going back to that this is a global moment. It's a predictable part of the process. That stage 5, the debt is too much. Interest rates are now going up to keep inflation from running away. We printed money like crazy. You've got the rise in conflict. When we printed money, when the Fed printed money to backstop what looked like it was going to be a potential contagion from SVB. Obviously, I think there were 5 banks that ended up failing. Is this now contained, or is what the Fed did just going to forestall something that's inevitable?
The dominoes are beginning to fall. I mean, okay, you know what the next dominoes are, and you can imagine the dominoes. So, for example, they're not going to buy the debt. A lot of them are not. Those who bought the debt and have too much debt and have debt losses on government debt are not going to buy buy more of that debt, for example, and therefore, when the government sells more of the debt, there's not going to be an adequate number of buyers for that debt. You know that those who are hurting because they have those losses won't make loans, and a lot of those loans went to real estate, particularly commercial real estate. And you know that for various reasons in commercial real estate, that we don't use it the same way and so on. So you're going to have problems in commercial real estate. You know that this kind of money was also financing venture capital and private equity entities that also have cash flow problems, challenges. And so you know that funding is not going to be there in the same way. you know, as a result of these things, that a number of entities will cut costs and in their various ways. And so depending on that, the job market is changing. And you see it, for example, in tech jobs and other, if you're in some of those areas that are getting squeezed. And you see the same thing by and large, happening internationally. So you can see also that if you said, what is the value of those assets that are being held, that value has gone down a lot. And because it was bought on leverage, as you described, because it is bought on leverage, there are bad losses in different places. And then the question is, what are you going to do with those losses? In most cases, quite often, they're, don't mark them to the market, meaning don't account for them and recognize those losses, which is kind of, let's say, hiding those losses and hoping in time that they'll just over time, it'll be fine. But that'll produce a squeeze, that'll produce a problem. So I think we know those things. We know those things. And that's happening at the same time as we have an internal conflict taking place, such as the presidential election. So we're going to come into the presidential, and it's not just presidential election. Of course, it's a number of senators, congressmen, and so on, and who are at each other's throats about this, and who are going to fight with each other. Okay, and fight to win, not probably respect the rules as much, but fight to win for their side. And that's happening at the same time as we have the situation with China, most importantly, China and Russia, in terms of the issues, in terms of their things to fight over. For example, even there's going to be an election in Taiwan that'll also have a big bearing on this whole thing. So we know, I think, pretty much that we're going to have financial problems and economic problems at the same time as we have this internal fighting and this external risky situation.
You're at a stage in your life where you really want to help people understand the mechanisms, how to think through this stuff from a framework perspective so that we can apply it, God forbid, in the post Ray Dalio era. Let me run you through how I'm thinking about this moment, the questions that I'm asking myself. And then if you don't mind, help me correct the approach that I'm taking to this. So whenever we get in a moment where there's really, we're at what I see as the end of stage 5. I don't know if you would agree with that. So this is where, just again, to reiterate, so we've gotten over our skis on debt. The Fed is going to try to print their way out of this. All that does is create inflation. They try to break the back of inflation with high interest rates, but so many people got themselves into debt in the good times on variable interest rates, or that they bought long on something like a bond where it devalues based on what happens with the interest rates. So as the interest rates go up, either people just can't make their interest rates payments, or the debt that they were holding goes down in value. Okay, so you've got this moment where a lot of people are about to lose money, and a lot of people are going to be very uneasy. And you've got the political divide that's continuing to escalate. We saw the last election cycle here in the US where people stormed the Capitol. It was a very sort of unnerving moment. And now it's like, well, things weren't nearly as bad then as they are coming into the 2024 election. So I start thinking, okay, what is the safe move? And if I'm honest, Ray, I start looking at, where do I live? So is there a move to be made within the US? And so I start looking at places that feel more secure for the way that I think about the world. Or I start thinking, do I become a more globally mobile citizen? Is there something that I should be thinking about there? I've got a lot of my money in cash. And then one thing that we didn't talk about, which we probably should, you mentioned the word hard money. And so hard money, I'll give my layperson's definition. And then if any of this is inaccurate, please let me know. But hard money being something that has intrinsic value. So gold, precious metals become something that I start thinking more seriously about. Now, I'm what I'll call a digital native. So I think about Bitcoin is something on my radar. I know that you're maybe not a fan. But anyway, that's how I'm thinking about the world. I'm trying to be in cash. I'm not trying to be in anything long. I have Ray Dalio. I have zero leverage. I don't play with leverage. Even when the money was free, I didn't take on any leverage because that's the one thing that scares me. So safety is how I'm thinking about things. Now, I don't exactly know how to diversify well, but that becomes another part of how I look at this. And you've got the all-weather strategy that I know you've tried to articulate for people. So safety first, if I had to sum up my stance.
Everything you said is beautiful and very similar to the way I think, and I'll add a couple of things to it. But when we think about safety, we have to think about that as purchasing power, because a lot of people think if I put my money into a treasury bill, I get safety. Well, also look at whether that's giving you a return that's compensating for inflation. So I just wanted to tweak what you said.
That's a very important tweak. And now you're getting into where I feel undereducated. So how do we then think through that?
Before I go there, I want to say, and also here's the other advice. And maybe we're all wrong. Maybe there's nothing to worry about. Okay. So how do I deal with that? Like what this guy Dalio is saying is very crazy, and you know, who knows whether he's right or wrong, and you know, he's been wrong in the past, and who knows if it's right. And simultaneously. So okay, that's exactly what you said is the way pretty much I look at it. What you said, and if I was to paint the world, I painted the world the way I did. Okay. And I have those questions. And then beyond that, I say, you as an individual should think about the total safety, including maybe that terrible scenario doesn't happen. Okay. That's what I'd like you to do. That's what I'd like you to do. And if you do that, you will come to a better balanced position. I want you to get balance. Okay. I want you to do certain things. I want you to have enough savings, whatever, you know, that, okay, to have security, to build the first level of, I think investing, which is the same as savings, comes in tiers. Tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 on risk. And the first tier is if everything goes wrong, I'm okay. And everything could be inflation, depression, anything, whatever it is. I lose my job. I you know, whatever it is, I got that thing covered. Then your next level is, okay, what am I going to get the highest returns? What is my best bet? Okay, but start at that level. And then you said the other thing too, that it's not just the investment, it's where am I? Am I in the middle of a fight? Like, I don't want to be in the middle of a fight. Okay, what's it going to be like? So it does have geographic implications. You know, I don't know, maybe it's the state or the state you go to, or the city you go to, or the country you go to, or whatever it is, you know, like, and there are certain things you can do to say this one's going to be better than that one. Let me give you an example of that. There are three things you could do based on these three influences. Are you going to be in a place and around people and circumstances that are financially strong? In other words, the income better, are they earning more than they're spending, and they have a good balance sheet? Because that means stability. If you can go through that and you have stability, places that are like that are better off. Number two, do they have internal conflict? Country, place, and is it a hospitable environment for me? Okay, that's the second. And then third, are they in the risk of an international war? Like, I don't want to be where the fighting is. I really don't. I don't want to be safe and stable and so on. So this is a time for looking for such things.
Yeah. Okay. While deeply unnerving, I think incredibly important to think through that. Let's talk about diversification, doing that well. You talk about uncorrelated assets, and I don't know how much you talk about this publicly, but I'd love to understand. It seemed like for people that don't know your background, you have a meteoric rise. You're in your 30s, on top of the world, unbelievable success. You make a huge bet on something, to your point earlier about have the humility to know that you may be wrong. You made a huge bet on a collapse, and it didn't play out. And it ended up that the market went up and you lost a lot of money, almost lose Bridgewater, managed to keep it together. You come up with a new strategy that I believe is known as pure alpha. It ends up getting tested multiple times in the market, and you guys crush when other people struggle, which leads you to be, for people that don't know, the largest hedge fund.
We made money in 28 of the last 32 years. We never had a really bad year. We made, I think it was during my time there, running at 11.8% a year, with the worst year being, I think it was down, I don't know, 10 or 12% sort of thing, and the next worst year being like down 1%, and we did that by simultaneously looking for opportunities and looking for good returning assets that were not correlated. Diversification of good, and just as you point out, what happened was, and by the way, those returns are not correlated with the stock market or whatever. So they were stock market, bond market, they're uncorrelated. So they were effective diversifiers in portfolios, which almost all go up and down together. And this was diversification. And so it was loved by investors, institutional investors, and so on. And the thing, and as you point out, what I learned from, basically this punch in the face mistake, this painful mistake, is I learned how to make good money without having big loss. I learned how to improve my return relative to my risk. And I learned that the holy grail of investing is 10 or 15 good uncorrelated return streams. You get that and you will, I don't know, have a similar path to the path I've been fortunate enough to have. And so that's what I want to pass along to people, you go into the COVID year, the one year that we lost, I don't know, it's 10 to 13% or something, was 2022 because COVID came along. I didn't have COVID in our system. We had other things. So that was it. And so there's, something comes along all the time for anything. Everything has its time. And so you put your money in any one thing. You could think, oh, okay, movie theaters are good, and then you get COVID, or cruise lines are good, and then you get COVID, and or whatever it is good. Well, it's good sometimes, but there's always something that always is going to mess up the one thing. So you don't want, like, in my opinion, you don't want more than 10% of your money in anything, and you want, probably you don't want more than 7.5% of your money in anything. And they want to be good, different things. And that's the message I'm trying to convey.
Right now, one of the things that has me the most unnerved is the attack on the dollar. So you've got the BRICS nations, for people that haven't heard that acronym before: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are getting together. And I know this has been going on for quite some time, so I don't know if I should be overly paranoid about that in this moment or not. But again, going back to those indicators that point to a transition from phase 5 to phase 6, do you think there's anything that we can prepare for as we look at the big cycle, as we see this particular moment with the assault on the dollar? Is there anything in the big cycle that can educate us on how to deal with this moment?
Just all happens over and over. The decline of the British pound as a reserve currency. Before that, the decline of the Dutch guilder as a reserve currency, all happened for the same reasons, which is, two things are going on. First of all, they're holding all of this dollars, and the stuff that we talked about is going on. And then also there's the weaponization through sanctions of the dollar. In other words, the United States' greatest weapon to use, as distinct from its military weapon, is sanctions. And so sanctions mean you freeze other assets, you freeze assets. Those assets are the bonds. And so that happened with Russia, and there are threats of it with other countries, China, and so on. And there's kind of the thinking, well, if I hold the bonds, can that happen to me? And and then why am I transacting in this other third currency rather than transacting directly? So, for example, the United States share of world trade has declined, and China's share of world trade has increased to become greater. And so if two countries are trading, let's say Saudi Arabia is trading with China, why do they why do they go to the dollars in order to do that? No good reason to go to the dollars, and they don't know that. Then they're worried about holding the dollars because they might get sanctioned. And so you see more of those transactions taking place in other currencies. And then the usefulness of the dollar as a storehold of wealth changes. It's like, think about it in, the most fundamental way. Everybody wants a medium of exchange and a storehold of wealth. So in other words, if everybody's using the dollar in world trade, then you want to save in dollars, because you say, okay, now that's the thing I spend in, and I save in the dollars. But over time, as the share of world trade goes down, why aren't they denominating in like China has a larger share of world trade? Traditionally, the countries that have the world's reserve currency have the largest share of world trade and the largest share of world capital flows. And because the United States has declined, and also there's a worry about that, holding it because of sanctions. I mean, just imagine how the Chinese must feel about having a lot of money in treasury bonds. Like, I would be worried that I would be treated like Russia would be treated. It's not something I would want to hold as a safe asset. And other countries like who might feel that they can get sanctioned, and for all those reasons, they're less inclined to hold. And when we call dollars, what we're really calling is dollar debt, because you hold dollar debt. And that's what is a debt? It's a promise to receive currency. So, okay, so now getting out of those things and transacting in other currencies seems to be the safer thing to do for those countries. And so that's the dynamic that's taking place. So it's not an attack on the dollar. It's like, I don't want to hold those things. And so very similar to on the British pound, what happened is the British had the war, and they were the most powerful empire ever in the world. And they had World War II, and they came out of World War II financially in debt, a lot of debt. And who held the debt? All these countries held the debt because that was the residual from that. But they had a problem. They had a debt problem. And so they needed to print more money because it was too much of a squeeze. And then you had, so it deteriorated, and then they sort of said, please hold my debt, please hold my debt. They went to Commonwealth countries, the part of those that were in the former British Empire. And then you had the Suez Canal incident, where there's sort of a war, and everybody realizes, well, hey, wait a second, that British Empire ain't the British Empire, and they're heavily in debt. And then they say, I don't want to own that debt. And there went the British pound. So that's just how the mechanics work.
Okay, so looking at the U.S. and I don't want to be cheeky and say speaking directly to the U.S. government, but if I were to be so bold, so if this is that predictable moment where, okay, there are actions that we can take as a country that will either help us keep the world reserve currency status, and there are actions that we can take that will cause us to lose that status more quickly. It seems like, okay, you've got the BRICS nations. They are moving away from the dollar. It seems like that card has already been played. I don't know if you think there's anything that we can do to make that easier. But certainly speaking to printing. So one thing that I've heard recently, and this is a really fascinating concept, that when you have other nations that are holding your currency, holding debt, as you said, they're not like hoarding cash, but they're holding a lot of debt. If we print money, what we're essentially doing is externalizing inflation. So we are causing a devaluation of that debt for all the countries that hold us. Now we're in a moment with rising interest rates that's causing us to need to print, but creating this really weird, difficult moment where as we print, then we have a need to raise interest rates. But the reason we're having to print is because we're raising interest rates. So it's a very difficult moment. But if we could, going back to your idea, it's how we are with each other. If we could get people to come together in the middle, would one of the things we would want to convince the U.S. government to do is to be very cautious about devaluing the dollar? Is that an important idea?
It's more basic than that, and it's more simple, but it's also more difficult. What the reason cycles exist is that the next stage has been determined by what has already happened in the prior stage. So we are in debt a lot. You can't change that. We got a lot of debt. And if you say, what could you do? I mean, two things come to mind. What you could do is you could be financially strong, and you can not use financial sanctions as a weapon to scare the holders of those bonds. But to be financially strong requires you to not spend more than you earn. That means you either have to cut your spending or raise your earnings. Okay, that ain't easy. Okay, so are we going to cut our spending? Okay, now you look at it. What are you going to, infrastructure programs, I don't know, poverty transfers, defense spending. Okay, what are we going to cut? The world, governments have the same basic economics as people, except for the fact that they can take money from one person and give it to another, and they can print money. That's it. And so when you look at this, okay, you have that gap. You can eliminate the gap by taking money from some and eliminating another and not spending much. Okay, that's not easy, right? Okay, what are you going to... Most governments now don't think, how much money do I have to spend, and then how do I prioritize that? They think, I need to spend on this, I need to spend on that, and I need to spend on that, and they spend on it, and then they either produce a deficit, and then you either have to pay it back with hard money or printed money, and that's situation. So when you say, what could we do? Well, you've got to get financially strong in a politically fragmented environment in which everybody wants more. And you have to, like, be a higher percentage of world trade so that everybody wants to use your currency, and and not threaten the holders of that bonds with freezing their assets.
It is it's a tall order in this moment. It has become so clear to me in the last month since you and I saw each other, how important, the reason that you keep coming back to it all comes down to how people treat each other. So in this moment, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but it does feel like the die is cast a little bit. I don't see how we pull ourselves back from the precipice, because to your point about being fiscally responsible, like we'd have to get into a position where we're making more than we spend. I want to circle around to something. As you were talking, you mentioned infrastructure, and it got me thinking about, okay, what are things that we would need to go right? So I think everybody is aware, and I've heard you say that there are changes that are going to need to be made to capitalism in order to bring back a thriving middle class, and the importance of the thriving middle class. And you've defined the things, again, staying to the theme of principles here, of the three things that we need to do to be strong as a country, or for any country to be strong. And you said 2 parents in the home, great public education, and then equal opportunity. Where do you see us on those? Are we moving in the right direction, moving in the wrong direction?
Well, again, maybe I aspire too much to 2 parents in the home. It's certainly better if you have 2 loving parents raising a family. That's good, but maybe that's too much to ask for. But in other words, good parental guidance. Okay, you're raised well, you're educated well. You can go to a public school that educates you well, and you have good guidance, so you're well raised in a healthy environment. And not only do you learn, skills and all that, but you learn how to behave well with each other. So you learn civility, and so you come out capable and civil to a land of opportunity in which you can, work and have a good environment. And really, that's all you need if a society does that, right? And I think where the things that are going on. Education in a lot of public education is is deteriorating. It's a real problem. My wife works to help the poorest school districts, the poorest people in the state of Connecticut. And the state of Connecticut it's always 1, 2, or 3 in terms of the highest per capita income.
The truth is, hitting your career goals is not easy. You have to be willing to go the extra mile to stand out and do hard things better than anybody else. But there are 10 steps I want to take you through that will 100x your efficiency so you can crush your goals and get back more time into your day. You'll not only get control of your time, you'll learn how to use that momentum to take on your next big goal. To help you do this, I've created a list of the 10 most impactful things that any high achiever needs to dominate. And you can download it for free by clicking the link in today's description. All right, my friend, back to today's episode.
And in the state of Connecticut, as of the last survey, 22% of the high school students have either dropped out of high school,
Whoa,
or have absentee rates which are greater than 25% and are failing classes. So they're living in areas that don't have the things I'm talking about parents' nutrition and so on. And there's not adequate resources for them. For example, during COVID, we found that 60,000 students didn't have computers or connectivity to take classes. And the government wasn't going to provide it. So philanthropically, we bought 60,000 computers and give it to the kids, but we can't do that. So our society is, when you look at this, you see drug problems. You see how the cities are changing. The cleanliness of the cities, the education levels of the cities, mental illness, crimes, and so on. You're not seeing, you're seeing people fighting with each other a lot. Not all the time. There are wonderful places in the United States. Education, some of the best universities, their pockets, some of the their neighborhoods, but there is this encroaching. So you see infrastructure breaking down, school shootings. Okay, so you decide, how are we doing?
I think we're doing pretty badly. I don't know. I mean, look, it's not going to be a popular thing, but I think going back to what you were saying about the parents and maybe asking for 2 people is too much. Look, I get it. I think everybody's doing their best, and God knows, for any single parents out there, you have my love and respect. That it just seems like a hard job when there's 2 of you, let alone 1. So I'm not throwing shade, but in terms of cultural momentum, when I look at people not getting married before they have kids, incentives that end up leading people to where it's actually more economically advantageous to have a child when you're single, does not strike me as a great idea. And trying to reverse that trend, I think, is going to be really important. Really putting a ton of time and energy into making sure that we are looking at ourselves on a global stage from an educational standpoint, and understanding that we're competing against, just to really make it stark, we're competing against China. Now, I have employees that grew up in China. I actually have some contractors that are in China currently. And when I see the discrepancy of what demands the educational system places on them when they're young versus the demands that we place on our students when they're young, it creates a ripple effect as they get into the workforce in terms of just the expectations that they have of themselves, the drive, the desire to excel. So these strike me as really, really problematic things. I'd love to talk to you about Singapore. So as we're talking, and I haven't studied Singapore very closely, but when I think about, how they've created something that seems really amazing very recently and sort of born up out of nothing, is it those three principles? Two parents in the home, quality education, equal opportunity? I mean, is that it, or is there something else?
Earn more than you spend. Be well educated to help you earn more than you spend. Then be civil with each other. Be productive. When you come out equal opportunity, and it's not just like in Singapore, but it's true in other countries. There's a level below which nobody should go. Certainly, children should not go. Right? How can you have an environment that children, there should be basics of housing, healthcare, certain basics, because otherwise you build a cycle. When the children become adults, you might say, oh, it's up to them to do it. But if you mess up the children early, they become the adults who can't do it. And so you have this cycle, in which you have to take care of people. You walk around and look at it. You can see the gaps, the opportunity gaps. You can see the mental illness gaps. Walk down the street and, downtown Manhattan or lots of places, and see the gaps. Okay. And that adult who is screaming, and homeless and whatever, came from a place, a reason, that made him that way. And, so it's like why isn't the computer given to the kid who doesn't have a computer so he can have learning? Think about how difficult it is for the kid who doesn't have learning, and they have one parent, and that parent might have in a poverty and might have drug problems and all that. I mean, the kid can't make it. So the kid's going to come up to be an adult. Okay, what kind of an adult is it? It's going to be a problem.
So I know that a lot of people are going to say, okay, well, raise taxes, we'll have money for all of that. That doesn't seem to be how things work, but I'm open to being wrong about that. There's a book coming out I'm very interested to read called Taxes Have Consequences, which I don't think people think a lot about, but it is entirely possible that I'm wrong. So if we look at someone like Singapore, do they just have really high tax rates and they distribute it in a way that makes sense?
What they did was they required savings.
They require it?
Require savings. An employee, I think it works like this. Employee gives 12% of their incomes. An employer gives 22%, 10% of their income. So they saved something like 22% of their income is in savings. Okay. They do other things too. They have a tax balance, but they have a savings. And as a society, they earn more than they spend. Okay, so, and then on housing, for example, they have a public housing that is subsidized, that the person can take their savings with to use to buy that public housing that is a saving through that saving. So everybody has good housing, good public housing, and they own it. So if it goes up in value, they can sell it and so they have that. So the housing creates a good environment. They put a lot of money into education, equal education. It's not, people there don't have to go to a private school to get good education. So they have good education. And then they have the people who work hard and are civil with each other. And that's how it works. And forget about Singapore. If you look through history, these are basic fundamental things. So wherever they've happened in history, they've worked. And you can go back through all history. If you these basics, earn more than you spend, be well educated, be civil, be productive, those types of things. That those fundamentals work.
What is it about the human personality that makes it so common that people don't deploy those things?
It's so interesting to me because I found that when people get richer, the societies get richer, they typically get in more debt, which seems backwards. So for example, I watched the first time it happened when the United States started borrowing money from China. The United States had income that was per capita income 40 times those from China, and they're borrowing money from China. So I wonder, how does that really happen? And there's when you don't have much money and you're at a stage of life where you value money, you want to save. So there's a psychological thing. You don't have much money, you get some money, and you want to save it. And to save it means you have to lend it to somebody. Then what happens is, ironically, when everybody earns more money and it's easy to borrow, people will get in debt, or society will get in debt, or the government will get in debt. And also then there become very big wealth gaps. And people basically are interested in taking care of themselves. And so you have a fight over taxes or something. And so you have a society that borrows. Just even think the political system cycle. People pay, if you're a new politician and you run a state, or you run, let's say, a state, and it's before an election, it's in your interest to borrow and spend. Because nobody pays any attention to the borrowing, where the money comes from. They pay attention to the spending. So give them stuff, go spend, give them stuff, have a party. It's like having a party on debt. And there's this short-sightedness. It's like raising kids, they call it the marshmallow test, you ask a kid in early age, I can give you one marshmallow now, or I can give you 2 marshmallows in 15 minutes. Which would you prefer? And, okay, the smart one says, I can defer my gratification for 15 minutes and get 2 marshmallows. We have a lot of society who wants it now. So is it enjoyable to take your money and spend it on better infrastructure? Or let's take the education system. The education system, according to the Constitution, is a state decision. So it's not federal, not mostly federal money. Then you come down to the state, and it's mostly a tax district. If you're in this neighborhood, through property taxes and so on, you will get the money to educate your children in that tax district. So naturally, richer tax districts will have better money. And so like I'm in Greenwich, Connecticut. And last numbers I looked, I'm sure they're higher than this now, but it was not that long ago, is in Greenwich, Connecticut, it was $24,000 per student. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is like 10 minutes up the road, it's $14,000 per student.
Whoa.
And they need more money because they're poor. So if you just take, it's not just education. How do you clothe the kid? How do you feed the kid? How do you give them the computer that doesn't come through the school and all that? They need more, not less budget. So those are the mechanics of it. First, you have to go to bipartisanship. Like if I was president, I would have a bipartisan cabinet. And then if I was dealing with the economic problems, I'd get smart people from the right and smart people from the left who want to make this thing work. And I'd put them into like a Manhattan Project kind of thing. In other words, put them into 6 months in which they have to agree on a system that's going to work. Tie them together and force them to agree and come out with that and have them gain control over the extremists who are going to fight. Like, I don't really care exactly how it works, just as long as, like if smart people from both sides can get together and make it work, and then you come back to these basics, okay, how do you earn more money than you spend? How do you educate your children well, whether or not, and deal with those problems that way in a together way, you'll get the best outcome. If you don't do that, you won't get the best outcome.
Yeah, I think this is really brilliant. And for people that haven't heard me talk about our company culture before, it's very much in line with this. And these are things that I learned from reading your book, Principles. So when I read Principles, it was really life-changing for me. It was before you and I had ever done an interview, because what I liked about the book is exactly what you're talking about right now, this idea of a bipartisan cabinet. So in my own company, I'm not looking for people to agree with me. I'm looking for people that will challenge my ideas. I'm looking for disconfirming evidence. I want to get the smartest people that I can possibly attract to what we're doing and saying, okay, we need to disagree with each other well, so that we can identify the right answer. To your earlier point, you're going to be wrong so often that if you go into something thinking I'm infallible, I'm going to have all the right answers, you're just headed towards disaster. So my question is, how do we set up a situation where people can disagree well? What is that structure?
I think it starts with worry. I have a principle. If you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you need to worry. Because if you worry, you'll take care of the things that you're worrying about to the best possible way. If you don't worry and you just go headlong into these things, you're going to have a real problem. So I think that you have to have people first realize, what does that picture look like if we don't do these things? If we don't have bipartisan, if we don't solve these problems together, if we fight, you have to see the clarity of those two paths and have people choose the good path. Okay, we will figure this out intelligently to make the best possible thing, intelligently and together. Okay, it starts there. It's not a structure. Where does the structure come from? comes from people, okay? And it comes from people having a need to create a structure and a way of being.
So how do we get people to worry?
Well, maybe what we're doing. I mean, I think they have to worry at two levels. First, enough of us worry that we vote for it, or, we use our voting and our others to say, let's vote on together and compromise, and smart people doing these kinds of things. And that's worrying about the society as a whole. And then there's worrying of, as an individual, if they don't do those things, how do I take care of myself? Those are the two types of worries, or two types of impacts you can have, right? So I think they need to think of both of those.
For people that aren't familiar with Lincoln, how much have you looked into him? His idea of a team of rivals sounds like very similar to what you're saying about having a bipartisan cabinet. Is he somebody that you've looked at, or?
I know that I know a bit about Lincoln. I wouldn't call myself an expert, and I know that about him. And I think that's really, really great. Yeah.
So when, whether it's at Bridgewater or elsewhere, how do you facilitate people disagreeing well? Because let's say that you have an intern going against your chief investment officer. Like, how would do you take that person seriously? They have little to no experience. How do you set that up so that you don't waste time, but at the same time, you get the best ideas?
First of all, you explain to people, and you understand yourself, how important thoughtful disagreement is. So you remove it, you minimize it from being something that people view as a fight and get upset about. You have to change the attitude about disagreement so that, if you're in disagreement, then one of you is probably wrong. How do you know the wrong person isn't you? And then also, you still have to resolve the disagreement in some way. And so you have to have in place, first of all, an understanding and an intellectualization of that, so you don't get emotionally carried away in thinking, because I disagree, that's equivalent to a fight. Okay, so you have to change that psychology. And then once you do that, then you have to have protocols in place for doing that. Now, in my book, Principles, Life and Work, in the work part of Principles, I've outlined those things, those techniques that can be done repeatedly. So you have to have a system for that. And, and so let me make it very simple examples of that. If you and I are disagreeing and we sort of want to try to get at the truth, things that you can do is to mutually agree on a mediator. So, okay, you could step out of your argument and say, okay, this isn't working. How should we do this disagreement? And maybe let's mutually agree on a mediator. Like, we both agree that person, somebody we can trust and do it through. Okay, that's a good step. Then as you're doing that, carrying that through, you can also say, are you taking in the other person's thinking and replying to that, or are you just blocking? And there are techniques that you can do to demonstrate you've taken it in, okay, like repeat the other's point, and so on, and then reply to the other's point, and then do certain things like not interrupt. Or in other words, I have a rule, I call it the 2-minute rule. Somebody says, okay, can you give me the 2-minute rule? That means for the next 2 minutes, I can speak uninterruptedly. So there are techniques that you can use to first understand that it's not a big fight, that there's protocols. Okay, then how do you do that in a hierarchy? Okay, there are different ways you can do that in a hierarchy. But anyway, there are many of them. And, we're not going to have the time to go through them, but they're outlined in, my book, Principles, Life and Work. They're in the work principles part of it.
Yeah, that's something that we found really effective here is rules of engagement is how we refer to it. So whether it's the 2-minute rule or something else, but ultimately getting people to understand, I'm saying this in the context of somebody who's trying to figure out how we get, we know that the big cycle has a high degree of predictability, and I'm willing to accept that maybe the U.S. can't remain the reserve currency forever. Maybe we're not going to be the dominant world superpower forever, but that I want to handle that transition out as well as possible. And usually phase 5 to 6 ends with literal bloodshed, and things have to get so painful before people can correct course. And so trying to give people a framework, I know you're saying that maybe I'm looking at the structure too much, but I think in frameworks. So what's that rubric by which people can go into, whether it's the 2024 election, whether I think right now we're still in gridlock with the budget or the debt ceiling or whatever it is, giving people ways to navigate through this well. And so my thing is everything begins with the goal. So what's your goal? And even just getting any group to agree on what the goal is. Now, once we know what the goal is, then we can start saying, okay, what people or ideas are most likely to get us there? How do you stress test an idea? How do you know?
I just want to emphasize, though, as you're doing that, the people have got to agree how they want to be with each other first, before there's a structure. I mean, we can have structure. I can create structure. And we could do all sorts of things. We can have a bipartisan cabinet. We can have the going off for 6 months and doing the project. And we can do there's lots of things we can do. But you first have to change the mindset of going from I want to win at all cost to wanting that. So all I'm saying is when you say, I want the structure and I'm a structure guy, I want the structure and I'm a structure guy too. But it takes people wanting something. And so what is the goal? Like you say, the goal. You start with the goal. Okay, that we're not going to fight with each other in a dysfunctional way. Okay. That we will work together to overcome our differences, that we will be good with each other. Okay, if you put those things there and then judge those things, and you sort of then say, how are we going to do that? Okay, then you do to bipartisan structure or whatever, bipartisan cabinet, blah, 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 all that other stuff. Then you can come around to it. But you have to, if you're in I will fight at all cost mode, the structure of the Constitution is not going to work.
I'll give you my hypothesis on the only way to pull that off, and let me know if you see another option. Lord knows, I hope there is one. I've thought a lot about how you sway people into doing something that is more advantageous. I'm usually thinking about it for them. So just what's more advantageous for them. And it all ultimately comes down to you have a leader or a group of people for whom you're trying to earn the respect of. And by earning their respect, you do the right things. So I'll sum it up at the national level. We would need a leader that can actually bring the two sides together. Somebody who has a very clear vision. You've grimaced. For anybody that's just listening to this, Ray Dalio just grimaced hard. All right. So explain the grimace, Ray.
It's like wishing for the tooth fairy or something. I mean, it's like not going to the root cause of why you don't have that leader. Okay, if you look at history, this is one of the great challenges of a democracy, and when it gets into everybody fighting for their own cause with populism, And so, Mussolini comes to power to make the trains run on time because it's badly managed and so on. So somebody says, give me the dictator. Give me the dictator, and then I will, and I want that dictator. So that's what we're, okay, so how do you get that leader? Okay, it increasingly, I'm just dealing with the mechanics. So so how do you get the leader? And what do you do with the opposition? Okay, it's almost like, well, you have this fighting of the various types, and do you accept losing? And then does the opposition remain and undermine everything you're trying to do? So it's almost like it gets to mob rule. That's why the dictators come to power. Okay? So that's just history, and that's all understandable, if not desirable. It's still understandable that that's the mechanics. So to wish and say, okay, we need a strong leader who will get control and make everything go all right, sounds a little bit like wishing for the tooth fairy.
That is how dictators come to power. That is very much the scenario I would want to categorically avoid. So do you see that just as that is an inevitability? Because right now, Ray, to your own point, we are not being good with each other. From what I can see, there is certainly a broadcast signal, and maybe this is a distortion of social media, but I don't think so. Certainly not given the elections of recent. There is a broadcast of a signal of massive division. In a moment of massive division, you get people fighting. In a moment where people fighting, there is a winner-take-all scenario. That's the path to dictatorship. So while my path may be wishing for the tooth fairy to want somebody who's inspiring that can unite people, I'll ask it pointedly. Do you just see it as an inevitability that we head towards dictatorship?
When you say have a leader that way, you're not dealing with the mechanistic determinants to say, how do you get a society that is splitting apart and operating in the way that I described to have a leader that leads and people follow properly? Okay, you're skipping over that. You can't skip over that.
Do you see a path, though, other than, because the natural way that this plays out?
The only path I can see is the one that I'm referring to. If you worry about the alternative, okay, so if you worry, look at that. What is it? You must not have it. If the more people worry about that, then the more likelihood you won't have that. In other words, if you want to tilt the odds in all the different ways, I don't know, take out the ads, have conversations like this, do whatever it is and say, I worry of what's going to happen. So we must not have that. And we really must have this other alternative. I really want to buy into that other alternative. And you have somebody arguing for that other alternative, like, will you follow? And I'll tell you, the prime Mario Draghi in Italy. Let me just tell you the story very quickly of Mario Draghi in Italy. Mario Draghi used to be the head of the European Central Bank, which was like being head of the Federal Reserve for a number of years. And he and I got to know each other in that. He completed that. And he's highly, highly respected. He's Italian. And Italy has crazy anarchy. Like they've had an average of one prime minister a year, and so chaotic and so bad that all the political parties got together and said, we will be united under Mario Draghi. We will let him lead. We will turn it over to him. Wow. And he said, I will do that only as long as all the political parties remain united, because if they don't remain united, we're going to get into this dysfunctional fighting, and I know it's not going to work. So for a period of 18 months, he was prime minister of Italy, and very loved. People loved him. And then one of the political parties dropped out because they disagreed on his approach for, I think it was handling Ukraine. And he said, okay, now I'm resigning, even though everybody wanted him to stay overwhelmingly. But he said, I can't govern under that kind of a fragmented environment. And, in other words, he knew where it was going to go. So he resigned. And in the period between him resigning and actually turning it over to the new prime minister, we had lunch. And we were talking about these things. And what he was describing and what exists is the issue that we're talking about, the inability of a leader to be able to lead when there's so much fragmentation. And if you look at the history of democracies, and you go back to Plato, Plato's Republic, he wrote the Plato. A lot of people think Americans invented democracy. It existed way back, in the Roman and Greek times and all that. And so he looked at the cycles. And what he said was, there's this cycle of these different systems. One leads to another in this way, where what happens is the greatest risk of democracy is an anarchy, because the fragments, it becomes uncontrolled. They all have their interests. They fight and they tear the thing apart. And then, so what happens after that is then you get the dictator. And you get, ideally, the benevolent dictator. In other words, the one who really knows how to make good things happen, and he cares about the country. He doesn't care about his personal wealth and those kinds of things, and they create that. And to create order that comes about that. And then in that cycle, after a period of time, you inevitably get the incompetent or selfish dictator. And then you have a revolution, and then you go to a democracy and so on, and these things go in cycles. And so when you're asking the question, of the leader, you're saying, okay, let's create a leader and have them go lead. You can't ignore the fragmentation and the inability to lead in that set of circumstances.
I agree with that. But if you, even in your own example, what you had in Mario is somebody that is able to garner the respect of all the different factions. Now, I understand that it ultimately broke apart, but he is the tooth fairy that I'm talking about. You need somebody that people can unite under.
But it didn't work because of how the people behaved with each other, and it won't work. Okay?
Yeah. Okay, so if we know that people aren't going to stay united for long, what you're saying is the duration that people can stay united is the duration that you can have that sort of peace, prosperity, and the second that you...
How long is that duration here? I mean, let's look at the situation. I mean, it doesn't exist, let alone have a duration to it.
Yeah. Ray, you say very troubling things in a very calm manner, which I think is probably the only way to say them. All right. So as I then step back and I say, okay, the cycles are what the cycles are. You said something earlier, which I think is really important that I want to reemphasize. What's happening now is a determination from something that happened earlier. And so to some extent, you're in a better position to deal well with the way things are, the reality. I've heard you talk a lot about that. The reality is what the reality is. You need to be awake. You need to be paying attention to that reality. And then you need to base your plan of action based on the truth of that circumstance. To do that, though, one thing I think is incredibly important is people have to be able to strip their emotions out of this. I know you're a huge proponent of meditation. How do people get good at removing emotion from the equation so that they can see reality accurately?
Well, meditation is a huge benefit for that. So I really, it gives one both a calmness and a clarity. And it gives one an ability almost to go above everything and look down on it and say, okay, here's how things work. And an acceptance of reality. It's like this serenity prayer. God, give me the serenity to accept that which I can't control. Give me the power to control that which I can, and give me the wisdom to tell the difference. And, just to be able to approach things in an open-minded way, like we talk about, you asked the question about disagreement. How can I approach disagreement? Do I emotionally get into a fight about it, or do I handle it well? Meditation and those types of things, calming yourself down, viewing everything more like think of a reality as being like a game, like a chess game. Okay, calmly. Okay, this thing happens, and what's your next move? And how does it work?
Okay, very fascinating. So if you take a chess grandmaster or anybody that's really proficient at chess and you put a chessboard in front of them, they look at the board and they don't have to analyze each individual piece. They know that pattern on the board very well. They know where you are in the game, and so that's a chunk of information. It feels like a very similar approach to the way that you're looking at financial markets, global movements, the big cycle, in that, I can drop you into a scenario. You'd look at a few key pieces of information. You'd know where we are in the cycle. So, starting with the 3 forces that we talked about at the very beginning. Hey, tell me where those 3 forces are. You expanded it to 5. But tell me where we are with those 5 forces. That's the chunk on the chessboard that I need. Boom. Now I know how to take that next move.
That's what I want to try to give to people, okay? That's why I have the animated video on YouTube. That's why I have the book, because it's like watching the same movie happen over and over again. You can see it, and you understand the cause-effect relations, so you can understand. So when you ask questions like, how do you get better? And then we deal with the mechanics of that. Like, okay, how do you get financially better off, and how do you be good with each other and not be threatened? It's just, if you look at it that way and you understand the mechanics, it is what it is. That's how reality works. And then how do you deal with it?
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, so in terms of chunking, in terms of understanding where we are in the cycle, one thing that I'm thinking a lot about is, as we go into the 2024 election, I've heard credible people say that they think China is going to make a move on Taiwan in the sort of chaos of the division that we have here in the current global superpower. Do you see that as a logical move on the chessboard for China? Is that something that seems plausible to you?
I have very good contact, so I have close contacts on both sides, and so I'm just wanting to say it rather than just throwing out an opinion. My opinion is that there's a political situation in the United States that it's really the issue of how much the United States pushes the issue in Taiwan that makes it risky, because there's a a move for of, let's say, hawks or some to defend Taiwan. So let me just give you the facts. If there is I'm going to give you a little history. Okay.
Please.
Taiwan was part of China. And around 1840, foreign powers came into China, and they wanted to trade and do things with China, and China didn't want to do that. And so around that time, they had the Opium Wars. You may have heard that in history, in which the Chinese at the time said, I don't want to trade. You don't have anything that I want. And then they brought in opium that the Chinese wanted so that they would have this trade and whatever, and then militarily won and took over large parts of China, took control of that. And in 1895, it was many foreign powers. And in 1895, Japan takes Taiwan. Okay, fast forward. You go into World War II, and after World War II, the winners of the war get to divide up the world and said who gets what. And Taiwan was given back to China. That's 1945. Then they have a civil war. As usual, the left and the right, they fight each other. And so the capitalists get kicked out by the communists, and they go to Taiwan, and they control Taiwan. Okay, so everybody agrees that China is part of, Taiwan is part of China, but they argue who controls China. The ones in Taiwan say, oh, we control China, and the ones in Beijing say, we control China, but everybody agrees with that. 50 years ago, so that's a big issue in their mind because it's part of China, and it's been told to them that it's part of China. Taiwan's part of China, but the capitalists, which is called the Kuomintang, they are living in Taiwan and they're not controlling it. So Henry Kissinger first makes gets together, goes to China and deals with reunification, and then Nixon follows. And there's this argument, and they reiterate that Taiwan is part of China. Everybody agrees on that. And that there should be peaceful unification of China. And that goes on 50 years now and brings it up to where we are today. Okay. So a red line for China is if the United States or Taiwan says Taiwan should be an independent country, that would produce a war. And everybody knows that. All those in government would know that would produce a war. This is a big thing for them. In other words, they call that period of time 100 years of humiliation. It was taken, it's promised back, and whatever. It's in their mind an indisputable reality. Now we're in a situation in which the United States, and particularly some congressmen who are more hawkish, say, good chance they will say, we will militarily defend Taiwan and then go on and sell them more military equipment. So it's very, very close to saying I will, it's a separate state. So we're very, very close to that particular issue. So what will come, I don't believe China is going to initiate a move to take control of Taiwan, unless the United States crosses that line, pushes that line. Now, so the way that it is understood, and just by different parties, is it's understood by the Chinese to be the way I describe it. Look, it's been promised, it's here. No, that's an uncompromisable thing. And Americans, I think about this communist dictatorial bully that is trying to take a free country, a free people, and in a aggressive way take over them, and that we need to defend liberty and protect them from that. Okay. I just want to emphasize it's more complicated than that in the way that I said. And also, it's like from the Chinese point of view, it's part of the American containment strategy, which means, China has grown and it's become a higher percentage of world economy and so on, and it's expanding. And it's like Taiwan is the lid on this boiling pot. So that's my best description of what the situation is. So I would say, if you want to know what really happens, watch it the way I describe it. In other words, is it unprovoked, or is it provoked in the way I just described it? Now, again, I'm a very realistic person. I'm not an ideological person. I'm not trying to, okay. I'm just like, how does reality work, and what's the move, and what's the next move? And I'm just trying to describe that reality. I'm not taking a side in it. It's just like two sides in a chessboard, and I'm just looking down at the chessboard.
Ray, what are the things that you think people need to understand about the world to navigate it well? And I'm asking this now at this moment because hearing even how you answer the question of China, if I had to guess what you're going to say to my question, I would say it would be people need to understand human nature. People need to understand finance. People need to understand.
I think you're making it too complicated.
Oh, give it to me.
I think people need to understand the basics, the fundamentals, and the story that repeats over and over and why it occurs.
History.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and understanding the cause-effect relationships in it, right? You can't expect somebody to understand all the things in finance, and you don't need to. You don't have to, all the things in human nature and psychology, you don't need to, okay? It just comes down to kind of pretty much simple, basic stuff that repeats in a cycle for the certain reasons. That's why I try to make it in these simple, entertaining videos, right? I put 3 videos together. How the economic machine works in 30 minutes, principles for success in 30 minutes, and the changing world order, and it's in 40 minutes. And these are just basics. If you understand that, like, what makes a healthy society? We boiled it down. You don't need to know a lot of complexity in order to understand, like how do you raise your kids? Do you earn more than you spend? It all kind of comes down to those kinds of basics. And so you need to understand those, I think.
We'll link to those 3 videos in the show notes, but where can people follow along with you and what you're doing?
I'm on LinkedIn, but I also post on all the major, and sometimes if it's more in depth, it's on LinkedIn.
Guys, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you want to learn about why saving your money is the surest way to lose buying power, then make sure you check out this interview with Robert Breedlove.
Oxygen, pretty important for human life. There's no price on it. Why? It's not scarce. Something like diamonds, not that important to human existence, yet has